The Pressman Negatives is a photographic narrative that explores issues of time and memory. It is the ostensibly true story of jewelry thief Sidney Pressman, his cohorts in crime, and the dark world they inhabited in a Midwestern city during the 1970s. It documents the final days of Pressman and his criminal colleagues brought together for one last heist, the burglary of a rare coin and jewelry store. An amateur photographer, Pressman, snapped these pictures during the crime's preparation, execution, and aftermath. They are presented here along with two newspaper clippings that corroborate the story and track its unhappy denouement. In the spring of 2003, I bought a box of used books at the Marin Flea Market in Sausalito, California. What caught my eye was an incomplete set of the Illustrated Home Library published in 1956. Several days later, I discovered a worn manila envelope stuck between the pages of one of the books. Inside were close to 60 35mm negative strips. There were also two yellowed newspaper clippings describing the violent deaths of two men over 20 years ago. Soon after, I began to print the negatives while trying to piece together the facts behind them. After many fruitless telephone calls to Ohio state officials, I flew from California to Cincinnati and began my search for Sidney Pressman's hidden world. I visited the newspaper morgues at the Cincinnati Enquirer and Central Press Association wire service. I spent a day at the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus and 2 at Cleveland State University's Special Collections facility. But my most compelling time was spent walking the streets of Cincinnati and Newport, comparing pictures with actual locations and talking to old-timers. In due time, I unearthed a fascinating story of a daring plan and its ill-fated end. By the early 1970s, Sidney Pressman headed a group of small-time crooks based around Cincinnati, Ohio, and Newport, Kentucky. Their after-hours targets of crime were jewelry stores and company payroll stations. An amateur photographer, Pressman used photography in the meticulous planning of his heists. He also photographed for pleasure. Thus, my newly found treasure represented both criminal research and candid shots of the people and places that formed Pressman's world. In the early summer of 1979, Pressman devised a plan and assembled a crew to execute what would be his last big score. The target was Murchison's, formerly Steinberg's, a jewelry, rare coin, and pawn shop located in downtown Cincinnati. In addition to Pressman, the gang consisted of wheelman Tommy McGraw, lookout Randy Kennan, and expert safecracker Dave Rhodes. Fight promoter George Peedy would furnish the upfront cash and would also fence the goods. In addition, the cast of characters included Sherry Peedy, George's wife, Meta Carson, who made phony documents out of her Newport, Kentucky portrait studio, and Ann Houston, Pressman's girlfriend. The key to the operation was Sandy Meiselman, nephew of Old Man Murchison, the shop owner. Meiselman was introduced to the gang by George Peedy. He was the inside man, providing keys, a floor plan, and details of the security system for a cut-off to top. To Pressman, it sounded like a foolproof plan. After disabling the alarm, the gang would enter the shop, crack the safe, and leave with all the jewelry and coins they could carry. Pressman and Randy Kennan were to take the loot to George Peedy, who would pay cash on the spot. The gang planned to meet up later, divide the spoils, and disperse. Using Meta Carson's fake passports, Pressman and girlfriend Ann would start a new life in Mexico. The heist started to unravel from the beginning. After filling several large canvas bags with jewelry and rare coins, they exited through Murchison's rear door. Immediately, the gang ran into a passing patrol car. Guns were drawn, and in the ensuing shootout, Dave Rhodes was killed, Randy Kennan was badly wounded, and Tommy McGraw was captured. Pressman and the bleeding Randy got away, but the situation would soon get worse. For starters, Randy returned to his apartment and expired early the next morning. The Inside Man scheme was actually Sherry Petey's idea. Months earlier, she had initiated a secret affair with the hapless Sandy Meiselman. She also planned to bump off husband George before Pressman arrived with the loot. After the heist, Sandy met Sherry at the Petey's hotel room, both packed and ready to go. They tried to ambush George, but he shot them both dead. For his part, George Petey had intended to double-cross Pressman from day one. When Pressman showed up with the loot, George tried to get the drop on him. It ended with Pressman standing and George on the floor, shot through the heart. Pressman emptied out Sherry's suitcase and stuffed the valuables inside. He picked up Ann at her apartment and, with the phony passports, headed for the airport. After the robbery, police had been deployed to the Greyhound and Amtrak stations plus Lunken Airport. Pressman and Ann arrived at Lunken without incident, checked in, and proceeded through the departure gate. As they walked toward the plane, an overeager passenger elbowed past a couple. The suitcase fell and snapped open, its treasures spilling onto the tarmac. Resigned to his fate, Pressman stood as two detectives grabbed him and Ann. 25 years and 2,000 miles later, I had unearthed Sidney Pressman's story and its aftermath. On my last day in Ohio, I visited Hamilton Berger, former state district attorney and now in his mid-80s, living in a Columbus retirement home. He helped tie up the last remaining loose ends. I knew from the original clippings that Pressman was convicted and sentenced to life in the Ohio State Penitentiary, and that he was killed during an escape attempt 5 years later. I learned from Berger that after turning state's evidence, Tommy McGraw received a reduced sentence. After his release from prison, McGraw disappeared. Ann Houston was not charged and soon moved back to the Kentucky bluegrass country of her childhood. And Sherry Petey? Well, she found a pretty little spot in Spring Grove Cemetery near her mother and father.